Cutting off your parents has quietly become one of the most talked about and least understood decisions of our generation. It has been called everything from an act of empowerment to a crisis of empathy. Some say it's liberation, others say it's avoidance, but no matter how you frame it, the number of people doing it growing. A 2024 national survey found that nearly 1 in 4 adults under 40 has cut off at least one immediate family member, most often a parent. Another study from Ohio State University showed that while estrangement brings temporary emotional relief, it often triggers ongoing cycles of guilt, anxiety, and grief. The same neural circuits involved in mourning death. This isn't a fringe phenomenon anymore. It's a cultural shift, a collective recalibration of what family means when love and safety stop aligning. But why now? And why does it hurt so much, even when it feels necessary? For many, going no contact isn't an impulsive decision. It is a slow unraveling, years of boundary violations, manipulation, or emotional neglect that becomes a wired-in toxic thought pattern, driving behavior, and that is registered in the brain as a threat. When connection becomes unsafe, we, using our mind, have to choose between loyalty and survival. That's when distance becomes medicine. This mind decision filters through the brain as energy, calms the activity in the amygdala, cortisol drops, and the nervous system finally begins to regulate. But the same act that brings physiological peace can awaken emotional torment. And here's the conundrum in neuroscience specifically. The brain doesn't know how to separate protection from loss because the brain doesn't think or generate abstract thought. Relational estrangement is processed through the same pathways as the grief experience from death of a loved one. The anterior cingulate cortex, insula, and hippocampus all light up. This is because the brain is a filter or a messenger and interpreter, as Hippocrates said 2,000 years ago. You feel both relief and sorrow, as if you've saved yourself and lost a parent at the same time. It's the paradox of safety and belonging firing together in one mind. The brain doesn't generate, it just filters, whichever mind state you are in. Relief, sorrow, or a combination. So, you don't feel these because of a grief or safety pathway in the brain. You feel these because these are the thoughts you have created in your mind in response to the situation and then wired into your brain and body. Whichever thought you focus on, the corresponding network you built holding this thought will light up. And because of the energy and emotion in the thought, the amygdala, anterior cingulate cortex, insula, and hippocampus get a surge of energy, and we feel the thought through our entire brain and body. For some, this distance is necessary and life-giving. It becomes a form of neural rest, a chance to stop living in emotional survival mode because you don't have both conflicting thought networks firing up at the same time, which is exhausting and confusing. For others, it creates isolation, guilt, and what psychologists call ambiguous loss, grieving someone who's still alive. The brain and body fall into whatever pattern we are in our minds. You stop reacting, but you don't stop remembering, and this conflict shows up in our biology. The lowered immunity, the GI issues, the nagging aches and pains, and then there's the cultural layer. We still live in a world that romanticizes family unity, that quotes, "blood is thicker than water," without understanding the cost of keeping toxic bonds intact. At the same time, social media rewards independence and cutting out negativity. People are left wondering, when is distance wisdom and when is it avoidance? Neuroscience and psychoneurobiology can't answer that question morally, but it can explain biologically. When family conflicts become chronic, the toxic thoughts created from this result in toxic stress, showing up as stress languages. These toxic thoughts are like tangled thorny gardens in the brain and the body, changing brain waves, chemistry, and even DNA, hijacking the brain's communication centers. The body stays in vigilance long after the argument ends. Going no contact then isn't rebellion, it's regulation. It is choosing coherence when connection no longer provides it. Biology doesn't erase belonging. Even when you feel calm, another part of your brain still aches for what was lost. So today, I want to explore this phenomenon, the growing wave of people cutting off parents and the complex reactions in our psychoneurobiology behind that choice. We will look at when it's necessary, what it does to the brain, and how guilt and grief can coexist even in the name of healing. Because understanding this paradox isn't about choosing sides. It is love and safety no longer mean the same thing. And maybe by the end of this episode, we will see that going no contact isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's trying to begin again. If you're someone who loves understanding how the mind and brain work together, especially in those emotionally complex situations that most people don't talk about, this podcast is for you. Each week I explore how meaning becomes chemistry and how awareness can change the way you experience stress, relationships, and identity. We don't shy away from difficult conversations here. We look at them through the lens of neuroscience and philosophy, so you can understand what's really happening inside your brain when emotions feel contradictory. Because once you know how your mind drives your biology, you can begin to guide it instead of being guided by it. If that sounds like the kind of insight you've been craving, stay with me. We are just getting started. Now let's get into today's episode. When people talk about going no contact, they often describe it as an act of strength. But the emotional reality really feels strong. It feels conflicted, hollow, and uncertain. Because the truth is, cutting off a parent is not just an external boundary. It's an internal fracture that touches your core wired for love nature. It touches the deepest part of identity, belonging, and memory. The moment you stop responding, your world changes shape. You feel relief and disbelief at the same time. You might sleep better, think more clearly, even breathe easier. But under that peace sits a constant whisper of guilt. You try to move forward, but the memories pull you back. Every childhood photo, every old voicemail, every family story still holds a charge. It's not just nostalgia, it's unfinished attachment. Your non-conscious mind knows distance is necessary, but your conscious mind keeps pulling towards your nature, asking why safety and love can't coexist. That's because the brain doesn't categorize relationships as good or bad. The brain doesn't categorize because it doesn't deal in abstract thought. It deals in filtering and expressing the mind. The conscious mind categorizes relationships as familiar or unfamiliar. Familiarity equals safety, even when it hurts. So, when you remove yourself from a painful dynamic, the conscious mind experiences this as a loss, and the brain filters this loss as a distortion of its wired for love biology. The conscious mind now interprets absence as threat before it understands it as peace. And that's why relief and grief often show up together at the same time. One part of you exhales, the other mourns. When you consciously tap into the non-conscious mind, where wise reasoning and logic reside, you can process this seeming paradox and grow as a human. I've spoken to people who describe feeling both lighter and lonelier than ever. They'll say things like, "It's so quiet now. I don't know who I am without the chaos." That statement is more scientific than it sounds, because for years, their nervous system was trained by thought networks of all the negative experiences to orient around threats. Now that the source of threat is gone, the conscious mind-brain loop is recalibrating. It is trying to find a new baseline that doesn't rely on crisis to function and feel alive. That recalibration can feel like emptiness, but emptiness is often the mind's first experience of safety. It is what peace feels like before it feels familiar. It is the moment your conscious mind loop is waiting to see if calm is permanent or just another pause before impact. For some, this phase brings clarity and they notice more space in their thoughts, more control over their emotions. For others, it brings confusion. They miss the routine of reaching out even when it always ended badly. And that is because the brain bonds through repetition, not morality. Because whatever we think about and experience the most grows. It doesn't matter if a pattern was healthy or destructive. If it was consistent, it became encoded as a habit, and a distorted normal. So when that pattern ends, your brain sends alarm signals. Something's missing. What's missing is the cycle that kept the distorted thought network alive. And until it's rewired, it will feel confusing. This is why so many people describe withdrawal after going no contact. It is not just emotional, it's neurochemical and structural. Rewriting of networks is happening as energy is pulled from the distorted toxic thought network, reconstructing it into a healthier one. And this is a painful journey that takes at least 63 days and sometimes longer. The toxic thought network was constantly activated, creating an addictive effect to the anticipation. The text, the argument, the apology that never came. Dopamine fueled the chase. Cortisol sustained the tension. Now both systems are quiet, and the stillness feels weird and unbearable. The absence of drama can feel like the absence of meaning. You start wondering if you overreacted, if reconciliation is possible, if distance makes you the problem. Guilt is the mind's way of trying to close an open loop. It wants to restore harmony between love and loyalty. But awareness changes everything. Once you see that guilt is a byproduct of attachment, not evidence of wrongdoing, it starts to lose its power over you, and you can learn and grow and heal from the data it provides. Emotional loyalty doesn't end when contact ends. It just loses its direction. The love doesn't disappear. It lingers in search of somewhere to go. That's why memories surface so often after you create distance. They are the mind's way of metabolizing and making sense of what was wired into the brain and the body. You still remember. Healing isn't deleting the past. It's learning to live with the inevitable residue within the reconstruction of the new way of moving. And that residue shows up in unexpected places. You might find yourself avoiding conflict with others or fearing you'll repeat old patterns. Or you might overcompensate, becoming overly independent, convincing yourself you don't need anyone. Both are adaptations of a brain relearning trust. The emotional experience of going no contact isn't linear. It's a healing journey, an up and down healing journey over time. And my research and clinical work has shown this healing journey happens in 63-day cycles. Some days you feel grounded, convinced you've made the right decision. Other days you question everything. That fluctuation is not failure. It's integration. It's healing. It is the collaboration between the wise, reasoning, non-conscious parts of the mind, teaching the brain to update its map, to label peace as safe and chaos as unfamiliar. I often tell people that grief after estrangement is proof of capacity, not weakness. You grieve because you cared. You ache because you tried. The absence hurts because love existed, even if it was never safe. Awareness helps you hold both truths without collapsing into either or, and is evidence your non-conscious and conscious parts of your mind are working together, which is a good thing. You can acknowledge the harm and still honor the humanity of the people who caused it. So, if you find yourself missing someone you know you can't be around, that doesn't mean you made a mistake. It means your nervous system is still catching up to your awareness. Healing is slow because biology takes time to rewire what your mind already knows. That safety can exist without proximity. And that's what this first part of the journey is really about. Understanding that the emotions that surface after cutting off a parent or family member aren't evidence of failure, but evidence of the brain's loyalty to being wired for love. You can't erase attachment. You can only retrain it. And every moment of awareness, every choice to stay grounded instead of reactive, is your brain learning a new language. Peace without permission. Next, I want to show you what's happening beneath those emotions, what the mind and brain are actually doing when guilt and relief fire at the same time, and why this internal conflict is more about neurochemistry than morality. When someone cuts off a parent, what's happening in you isn't rebellion, it's regulation. The mind is trying to restore equilibrium after years of relational stress. Understanding this doesn't make the decision any easier, but it does help us see it for what it is, a psycho-neurobiological adjustment to emotional overload. When family relationships consistently activate fear, shame, or unpredictability, the brain's stress systems become warped. What was supposed to work for you now works against you. The amygdala, responsible for detecting threat energy waves in order to keep our wired for love nature intact, begins firing too quickly. The hippocampus, which plays a role in converting memories into a thought, into networks across the neocortex of the brain, does not distinguish between the emotions because it only computes algorithmically. So love and danger will become linked together. Because thought networks are not only built in the brain, they are also built in the body. Over time, the body begins anticipating harm, even in neutral moments. This is why the idea of calling a parent can trigger the same physiological responses as being yelled at, because the mind has trained the brain to expect chaos where safety should be. Eventually, the brain can't sustain that contradiction because it's wired for love and not fear. The prefrontal cortex, the part that becomes active when we start to collaborate with the wise, reasoning, non-conscious mind, becomes very active with increased brainwave activity, blood flow, and oxygen flowing through it. This neurological response really emphasizes our realization that proximity equals instability, and we begin prioritizing distance. That's the first step of neurological self-preservation. What looks like avoidance from the outside is actually our attempt to regulate and restore the balance in our internal chemistry. Research in Nature Human Behavior 2022 shows that chronic relational stress reshapes connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. Essentially, the brain's emotional balance center starts overriding its reasoning center. Emotional cues begin to feel like physical threats. For some, cutting off contact becomes one form of regulation. When every attempt at safety within the relationship has failed, it's you and your nervous system trying to recover. But distance is not the only way our psychoneurobiology recalibrates. For others, safety can be rebuilt through awareness and self-regulation, new communication patterns, or guided conversations that reshape meaning. New habits are wired into the brain by the mind through repetition. So when healthy interaction becomes the new pattern, chemistry and wiring will adapt. And that's why no contact should never be seen as the only answer. It's one option in a spectrum of regulation. A last resort for when proximity keeps reactivating harm. Still, the process of separation isn't simple. The moment you remove yourself from a painful dynamic, the brain enters withdrawal. For one, that person or persons has been entangled in your life for years, and they are quite literally wired into your brain and body as a real energy, protein, and chemical network that is fed through contact and communication. This has conditioned the brain to expect and react to certain emotional spikes: conflict, apology, rejection, repeat. Dopamine and cortisol are just two of the many hormones that fueled those cycles. When the pattern stops, those chemicals shift. The wiring in the networks change, and the absence feels like emptiness. The same neural networks that once associated love with adrenaline now have to learn calm without chaos. That's why relief and grief coexist and is what I call the paradox of protective grief. They come from two competing thoughts of the experience created by your mind and wired into your brain and your body, also by your mind, and they're firing together. The parasympathetic nervous system is activated when we feel safe to send signals through the brain and the body. When we have attachment issues, our mind signals loss, activating the sympathetic nervous system. MRI studies show that relational estrangement activates the anterior cingulate cortex and insula, the same areas involved in physical pain. The brain is simply a transducer of signals and doesn't distinguish between rejection and separation as injury, even when the separation was necessary. That's why you might feel a heaviness that doesn't match logic. It's not confusion, it's neural dissonance. The body hasn't yet updated its understanding of what safety looks like. Here's the hopeful part. The brain is neuroplastic, which means it's adaptable. So once the mind consciously reassigns meaning, for example, labeling distance as stability instead of danger, the neural networks are reconstructed and rewired. The mind then enables the prefrontal cortex to strengthen its regulation and dampens the amygdala's sensitivity. Cortisol levels will normalize, and the chemistry of vigilance slowly becomes the chemistry of calm. That process can take months or even years, depending on how long the original unmanaged toxic stress pattern lasted. It's definitely not linear. It's an up and down journey. One message, one memory, one dream can reactivate old pathways just like that. But awareness with self-regulation makes the difference. Every time you notice what's happening and remind yourself this calm is safety, not guilt, you are reinforcing the new association. Not every strained relationship requires distance. For some families, awareness alone is enough to change the chemistry. The brain can be trained that closeness and safety can coexist when conversations become consistent, boundaries are respected, and meaning is redefined. What matters isn't the method, it's the meaning. Awareness and self-regulation, not avoidance, is what rewires the experience of connection. Neuroscience calls this predictive processing. The conscious mind-brain loop constantly predicts what will happen next based on past experiences. When you change your response to those predictions, for example, choosing not to engage when you experience conflict, you are updating the brain's model of reality. Over time, the prediction shifts from danger is coming to peace is possible. That is the biology of relational repair, whether through distance or dialogue. The attachment networks wired into your psychoneurobiology that once connected you to your parents don't just disappear. They need to be deconstructed and reconstructed. And until this happens, they will still light up when you think of them, when you see a memory, or when someone mentions family. Some people describe this as feeling emotionally numb. Others describe it as feeling guilty for not missing their parents enough. Both are valid expressions of a mind-brain network in transition. Emotional blunting is the mind's way of giving the nervous system time to reset. Guilt is the leftover signal from the brain's attachment loops trying to find new meaning. The key is awareness and self-regulation. The moment you recognize what's happening, that your brain is following your mind's decision to protect you, you can start working with it instead of against it. You can stop asking, why do I still feel this way? And start realizing this is what recalibration feels like. The truth is, the brain doesn't control you. You control the brain. It is like a TV receiving signals and you choose which movie to play. It doesn't label parents as villains or you as a hero. You do this with your mind and you can change your mind. The brain simply records repetition. Whatever has been repeated most often becomes the strongest network with the most energy. And because expectation is what drives prediction, change always feels uncomfortable at first. And that discomfort is proof that your conscious mind is collaborating with your non-conscious. And this collaboration means that the mind is leading again. It is proof that awareness and self-regulation are beginning to rewrite the brain's chemistry and wiring in real time. You may not feel peace immediately, but the presence of discomfort is actually the evidence of change. It means the old pattern is losing its energy and authority. So whether you've chosen distance or you're learning to stay and rebuild boundaries, remember this. Both paths begin in awareness. Relief and pain are not opposites. They are stages of the same adaptation. Your mind made a decision that is still being wired in and grown into your brain as you learn to believe it. And that's what we explore next. The cultural and emotional myths that make this process so confusing and why so many people mistake survival for shame. Many of these rules sound noble. Phrases like family is forever or you only get one mother. But they often prevent honest conversations about what happens when family connection becomes unsafe. We are told that maintaining contact is the moral choice, while stepping away is the failure. But the truth, from a neuroscience and psychoneurobiological perspective, is much more complicated. The first myth is that cutting off a parent is always an act of resentment. Actually, in reality, it's often an act of self-regulation. When the brain associates family interaction with threat, distance becomes the nervous system's version of deep rest. Yet for some, that rest eventually turns into isolation. Because once the immediate toxic stress chemistry fades, the attachment networks that crave belonging start to ache. This is why some people who go no contact later return, not because the situation changed, but because the biology of connection is persistent. The mind can choose boundaries, but it still longs for repair. The second myth is that reconciliation is proof of growth, and distance is proof of bitterness. That narrative reduces healing to behavior instead of meaning. True growth isn't defined by whether you stay or go, it's defined by whether your decision is led by awareness and self-regulation, not avoidance. I have seen people heal through reconnection and others heal through silence. Both are valid forms of regulation when driven by understanding rather than guilt. Then there's the belief that forgiveness requires access. This idea comes from cultural ideals of unconditional love, but it doesn't match how the brain actually works. Forgiveness is a choice that begins in the mind, not a behavioral act that requires proximity. You can release resentment without re-entering a dynamic that reactivates pain. The moment you reframe an experience, your body's toxic stress response decreases. Forgiveness is about reducing your own cortisol, not reopening old wounds. Another myth is that boundaries signal disrespect. In reality, boundaries are communication. They tell your brain where safety begins and ends. They allow relationships without reactivity. When boundaries are dismissed, the conscious mind-brain loop reverts to vigilance. When they are respected, it learns trust again. And that is why setting limits isn't cruelty, it's chemistry and wiring management. But myths don't just come from family, they come from culture. We live in an era that glorifies extremes. On one end, traditional values pressure people to tolerate harm for the sake of loyalty. Digital culture romanticizes cutting off toxic people. Neither view captures the nuance of psychoneurobiology. Both oversimplify the reality that relationships exist on a spectrum and that discernment, not dogma, determines what regulation looks like. Discernment is the missing skill in most conversations about family estrangement. It's the ability to pause and ask, what does my nervous system need and what does my conscience agree with? When those two answers align, the brain relaxes because the right signals from these questions and answers are fed into it. When they conflict, the brain and body experience guilt. The goal isn't to eliminate either, it's to integrate them. Awareness and self-regulation bridges the space between biology and belief. Biologically, attachment isn't designed for comfort, it's designed for survival. And that's why people stay in painful relationships. The toxic thoughts from the experience create confusing toxic networks in the brain and body. And familiarity can get linked with safety when it's actually not safe. You can love someone deeply and still need distance from them. That truth is uncomfortable because it challenges the fairy tale version of family most of us were raised with. But understanding it doesn't make you cold, it makes you wise. Still, it's equally important to question the growing belief that distance is always healthy. Neuroscience tells us that isolation, when prolonged, can activate the same threat pathways as conflict. The absence of connection can eventually feel like danger itself. Some people find peace in distance, others find it becomes another form of toxic stress. And that's why no contact should never be romanticized. It's a protective measure, not a destination. When we treat family estrangement like empowerment, the brain functions on coherence. It can only work properly when the inside story and the outside behavior match. Whether that means rebuilding boundaries or rebuilding connection, the goal is the same, meaning that matches physiology. So how do we start reshaping these myths? By telling the truth about what love actually is. Love isn't compliance, it's coherence. It's the state where compassion and self-respect coexist. You can forgive without reconciling. You can reconnect without surrendering your peace. You can choose distance without carrying shame. The myths we've inherited about family make it hard to hold both empathy and boundaries at the same time. But neuroscience and psychoneurobiology shows that the mind is more than capable of dual awareness, compassion for others and protection for self. When you practice that dual awareness, guilt softens because meaning expands. You stop seeing your choice as betrayal and start seeing it as balance. That's what awareness plus self-regulation does. It doesn't erase love, it redefines it. It teaches the conscious mind-brain loop that safety and compassion can share the same space. Once that meaning changes, the chemistry and networks change, the toxic stress hormones rebalance, and the attachment system begins to stabilize. So, before we move to the reconceptualization, I want you to sit with this. Distance and devotion are not opposites. They are both forms of care expressed in different directions. Awareness and self-regulation help you discern which one your situation requires. Because what your brain chemistry ultimately needs is coherence. And coherence starts with meaning that tells the truth. So next we'll talk about how to rebuild that coherence, how to reframe love, loyalty, and boundaries so they no longer compete with each other. So far, we have explored the emotional and neurological reasons people go no contact and the cultural myths that make it so confusing. Now, I want to shift from explanation to meaning, because whether you stay, go, or something in between, the healing doesn't begin with the choice itself. It begins with how you interpret that choice. This is where the reconceptualization comes in. It tells you that your nervous system has reached its threshold. It means something in the relationship has stopped feeling safe enough for closeness to coexist with peace. The goal isn't to stay disconnected forever. It is to use that distance or that awareness as information. Awareness and self-regulation ask you to look inward too. Are you reacting to what's still happening or what once happened? Are you cutting contact to find peace or to avoid accountability? Real awareness and self-regulation don't just question others. It questions the story we tell ourselves about them. Sometimes distance is needed, but sometimes the harder work is learning to stay connected differently, to show up with boundaries instead of barriers. For some, the reconceptualization begins with redefining what family means. We are taught that love is measured by proximity, that if you love your parents, you should want them close. But neuroscience teaches something different. Love isn't proximity, it's coherence. It is the alignment between compassion and safety. You can love someone and still need boundaries. You can care deeply and still need quiet. You can even wish someone well and still not be in contact. Those are not contradictions. They are examples of the mind restoring meaning where confusion once lived. For others, the reconceptualization means learning that reconciliation is possible when meaning changes on both sides. When both people begin responding from awareness instead of reactivity, the brain starts building new neural pathways for safety in both people. The same chemistry that once sustained chaos can sustain peace, but only when the story changes. This is how some relationships begin to heal, not because the past is forgotten, but because meaning has been rewritten. And yet not every story resolves that way. Some parents can't or won't change. Some boundaries stay permanent. The reconceptualization here is understanding that permanence doesn't mean punishment. It means acceptance. The conscious mind-brain loop's job isn't to erase connection. It's to stop assigning danger to it. Distance can become the space where love exists without harm. This is one of the hardest emotional tasks we face as adults. Holding compassion for someone you can't safely be close to. The conscious mind-brain loop struggles with that duality because its natural instinct is to categorize. It wants to file people as safe or unsafe, good or bad. But the non-conscious mind's role is to expand those categories, to make room for complexity. You can hold sorrow and peace, grief and gratitude, love and distance in the same neural space. That's awareness. It's what makes emotional maturity measurable, not by certainty, but by capacity. The reframe or the reconceptualization also challenges the way we define healing. Healing isn't necessarily reunion, it's integration. It's what happens when your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors begin to align again after chaos. Either way, healing isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's about coherence between meaning and behavior. If you have chosen distance, the reconceptualization might sound like this. I didn't end love. I ended the confusion between love and harm. If you are trying to stay connected, the reconceptualization might be, I can stay in contact without surrendering peace. Both are valid. Both are forms of mind management, different directions of the same principle. Awareness also means acknowledging your parents' humanity, not to excuse harm, but to understand it. They came into parenting with their own baggage from their parents that was potentially not resolved. That perspective keeps your peace from turning into pride. It reminds the brain that empathy and boundaries can coexist, that compassion can survive even where closeness cannot. The mind matures when it can see others clearly without losing itself. In neuroscience terms, reconceptualizing changes the activation pattern of the prefrontal cortex. It increases the regulation of emotional impulses and reduces limbic activity. The mind assigns new meaning and the brain follows through chemistry and rewiring. Each time you consciously reinterpret a memory or reaction, you are shifting the prediction model of your nervous system. The past doesn't disappear, but its power to dictate your present begins to fade. And that's the science behind what we call peace. It's not the absence of emotion, it's the absence of confusion between what love is and what love costs. The reconceptualization also applies to guilt. Guilt often means that love hasn't found its new direction yet. The brain is loyal to attachment. It releases oxytocin and dopamine in response to connection, even when that connection is unhealthy. When you go no contact, those chemicals still surge in moments of memory or longing, and the conscious mind-brain loop interprets that as contradiction. If I feel love, I must have done something wrong. But love isn't proof you made a mistake. It's proof you're still capable of empathy. The reconceptualization is to stop trying to extinguish guilt and start interpreting it as a sign of emotional capacity. When you do that, guilt stops being a verdict and becomes data. It shows where meaning is still catching up to reality. Awareness and self-regulation transforms guilt into guidance. It helps you ask, what does this feeling want me to notice? Maybe it's unresolved grief. Maybe it's compassion without direction. The mind's job is to integrate that signal into wisdom instead of shame. Another important reconceptualization is realizing that reconciliation doesn't have to mean contact. It can mean reaching an inner resolution where you no longer carry emotional charge. The point when your brain stops reacting to the memory as if it were happening now. You can grieve the version of your family you hoped for without needing to rebuild the one that exists. And if you ever find yourself reconnecting, awareness and self-regulation remains the key. But when you re-enter with coherence, when you know where safety lives, your brain can experience love without threat for the first time. That's what healthy reconciliation looks like. Not a return to old dynamics, but the creation of new ones. And the most powerful part of this reconceptualization is realizing that no matter how painful your family story has been, your mind is never powerless to assign new meaning. You can't rewrite the past, but you can rewrite its influence. You can turn guilt into gratitude for your awareness. You can turn loss into the space where empathy grows. You can turn boundaries into architecture of peace. So, whether your story involves distance, dialogue, or something in between, remember this: awareness and self-regulation don't take sides. It gives you the tools to stay compassionate without staying stuck. Because healing from family pain isn't about deciding who is right. It's about learning how to stay whole in the aftermath. Next, I want to show you how to apply this reconceptualization in daily life. A simple step-by-step practice that helps you balance guilt, grief, and peace so your emotions stop feeling like a contradiction and start feeling like information. Awareness gives you understanding. Practice gives you change. This next step is about moving from insight to application, a way to bring reconceptualization into your daily emotional world. Because knowing that love and safety can coexist in new ways is one thing. Teaching your brain to live that truth is another. It's called the neurocycle. Here we are using it to process the unique mix of guilt, grief, and peace that surfaces when family relationships become complicated. Whether you've created distance, are still in contact, or unsure what comes next, this 5-step method helps your mind guide your brain instead of reacting to it. Let's walk through it together. Step 1 is called Step 1, Gather Awareness. Start by naming what you feel. Not judging, just naming. Maybe it's guilt, loneliness, irritation, or even relief. You can't regulate what you can't see. So ask yourself, what emotion is present right now and what story is it telling me? Awareness activates the prefrontal cortex, the reasoning part of your brain, helping it to guide the limbic system where emotional memory lives. This is where the biology of compassion begins, when understanding replaces reaction. Step 2, reflect. Ask yourself, what is this feeling protecting me from? Guilt often hides love. Grief often hides gratitude. The goal isn't to get rid of these emotions, but to uncover what they are trying to communicate. When you reflect, your brain shifts from survival to integration. The amygdala's activity decreases, and the hippocampus begins linking emotion with context. That's how insight forms. Step 3, write. Externalize the thought. Whether you journal, record a voice note, or simply write a few words, you are creating distance between thought and identity. For example, I feel guilty for creating distance, but I also feel calm when I'm not in conflict. Once written, that thought becomes data, not destiny. Writing transfers emotional energy into cognitive structure, the first step towards good self-regulation. Step 4, recheck. Now ask yourself, is there another meaning available here? Could guilt mean empathy, not wrongdoing? Could grief mean love still looking for expression? Could relief mean your brain is finally safe enough to rest? Rechecking allows your mind to reinterpret the signals your body is sending. It is how you update your conscious mind-brain loops and the predictions that they make about what these emotions mean. This step doesn't deny complexity, it helps you integrate it. Step 5, active reach. Now, choose one small action that matches the meaning you want to reinforce. That could mean expressing compassion towards your parents from a distance, writing an unsent letter, praying for them, or sharing gratitude for what you did learn, even if the relationship was painful. Or it could mean simply repeating to yourself, peace doesn't mean I stop loving them. Each intentional act releases serotonin and dopamine, the chemicals of stability and purpose. This process isn't about excusing harm or minimizing pain. It is about making awareness tangible. It helps you metabolize guilt and grief instead of letting them harden into resentment or shame. Because unresolved emotion always looks for expression, and when you give it a healthy outlet, your brain learns that peace is safe to maintain. I also want to say this clearly. Sometimes the work isn't about staying away or returning. It is about developing emotional honesty while you are still figuring it out. You might not know if distance is permanent or temporary. That's okay. Use the neurocycle to stay self-aware while you gather more data from your own reactions. The goal is to stay conscious, not rigid. If you are someone who still has contact but feels emotionally unsafe, the same tool applies. When you use these steps, you are not suppressing your feelings, you are organizing them. And that organization reduces stress chemistry in the brain and strengthens your resilience. Awareness helps your mind become the leader again. For those who have already gone no contact, this tool becomes a bridge between the old story and the new one. It gives your brain a consistent framework to process the mix of calm and guilt that follows separation. Each time you go through the 5 steps, you are reinforcing a new pattern: peace without detachment, empathy without exposure. And for anyone wondering whether to stay or go, these same 5 steps give you awareness and self-regulation without pressure. They let your biology show you what your mind already suspects, that peace doesn't require avoidance and love doesn't require proximity. What matters is coherence between awareness and action. If you want to make this practice part of your daily routine, try this. Set a timer for 5 minutes each evening and move through the 5 steps. Write your answer to each one. You will begin to notice subtle changes, fewer emotional spikes, quicker recovery after triggers, a softer kind of compassion towards yourself and others. And that's the evidence that your mind and brain are working together again. When your brain learns that dual awareness is safe, emotional stability becomes sustainable. Because at the end of the day, peace doesn't mean silence. It means internal steadiness. It is the ability to stay kind without staying small. The neurocycle gives you a path to that steadiness. One conscious breath, one reflective thought, one compassionate action at a time. Next, we'll look at how this plays out in real life, the stories, the cultural patterns, and lived experiences of people who have faced this paradox of love, loyalty, and distance, and what their journeys can teach us about our own. When you zoom out and look at this growing wave of estrangement, you start to see patterns, not isolated stories, but shared human responses to pain, loyalty, and identity. It's not just individuals going through this, it's a cultural moment. The rise in people cutting off parents or redefining family contact isn't only a sign of dysfunction, it's also a sign of emotional awareness spreading faster than emotional skill. In my work and in the research I've done, I've seen a recurring theme. People aren't cutting ties to destroy family. They are trying to stop repeating pain. They are trying to build peace in systems that never modeled it. And yet, once they step away, many find themselves confronting an unexpected truth. That survival doesn't automatically feel like healing. The nervous system relaxes, but the identity built around belonging begins to ache. Relief arrives, grief follows quietly. Many describe this as an emotional hangover. After years of chaos, the conscious mind-brain loop is conditioned to expect crisis. It interprets stillness as absence. For some, that emptiness becomes the space where reflection starts. For others, it becomes a vacuum filled with guilt and self-doubt. They start to ask questions like, was it really that bad? Or am I just overreacting? These are not signs of weakness. They are signs that awareness is deepening. The conscious mind-brain loop is reconciling 2 truths at once. I needed protection, and I still long for connection. At the same time, there's another group of people walking a different path, those who stayed and tried to repair. Their stories show that distance isn't the only road to peace. With time, therapy, or mutual effort, some families have learned to rebuild trust through consistent boundary setting and accountability. In those cases, proximity stopped feeling dangerous because meaning changed. The chemistry and structure of vigilance gave way to the chemistry and structure of respect. Awareness, not avoidance, drove that transformation. Both outcomes, distance and restoration, share one common factor. Awareness and self-regulation led the way. In both cases, the decision wasn't about right or wrong, but about coherence. The mind was trying to align meaning with safety. When viewed through culture, tension becomes even clearer. Western societies often prize independence and self-protection. In some places, maintaining distance is seen as strength. In others, it's seen as betrayal. But neuroscience doesn't take sides. It shows that the human brain, regardless of culture, is wired for connection. Yet, it is also wired to avoid threat. The conflict between safety and belonging is universal. We live in a world that tells us to choose loyalty or freedom, connection or peace, forgiveness or boundaries. But the brain doesn't work in binaries. It can hold both. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that responds to reasoning, thrives on complexity. It's capable of integrating competing truths, that love can exist with disappointment, that grief can coexist with gratitude, and that distance can coexist with devotion. When you understand this, you begin to see that estrangement isn't a cultural collapse, it's a mirror. It reflects the state of emotional literacy in society. We've become more aware of harm, but not yet skilled at repair. We know how to protect ourselves, but not always how to reconnect without losing ourselves. That's why so many people describe their decision to go no contact both empowering and isolating, a kind of self-protection that meets one need while awakening another. This isn't just happening in families, it's showing up in friendships, workplaces, and communities. The same psychological forces that drive family estrangement, shaping how people handle conflict everywhere. Ghosting, cancelling, withdrawing. They all represent attempts at nervous system regulation in a world that doesn't teach emotional endurance. We are reacting faster than we are reflecting. Neuroscience explains this. In moments of emotional threat, brain loops fire too fast, sending confusing energy through the amygdala prefrontal cortex network, creating a disruptive feedback loop that confuses meaning. That means disconnection often feels like the only safe response. But when the threat's over and awareness catches up, the guilt returns. The conscious mind begins to process not only what happened, but what was lost, the potential for repair, the version of ourselves that once hoped it could work. That's why I think of this as a collective growing pain. We are learning emotional safety before we've mastered emotional repair. It's progress, but it's incomplete. The goal isn't to reverse the trend, it is to mature it, to teach people that boundaries don't have to mean barriers and that love can evolve without raising accountability. For anyone in the space, whether you have gone no contact, maintained a distance, or stayed and rebuilt, the real invitation is to use awareness as a bridge, not a wall. Ask yourself, am I protecting peace or am I avoiding growth? There is a difference, and your brain can feel it. Protection brings calm, avoidance brings tension. One regulates chemistry, the other reinforces fear. When you start recognizing these differences, guilt begins to change texture. It no longer feels like punishment, it feels like guidance. The same emotional circuits that once produced shame now produce compassion. The conscious mind-brain loop learns that emotional maturity means being able to step back and step forward, whichever direction coherence leads. This cultural moment, as painful as it sometimes looks, holds a quiet hope. It shows that people are thinking about emotional safety in a way previous generations couldn't. It shows that love is evolving from duty to consciousness, from obligation to awareness. But with that freedom comes responsibility to keep questioning, keep reflecting, and staying compassionate towards those who haven't learned this language yet. Because whether we are talking about parents, children, or communities, estrangement always asks the same question. Can love survive without control? Awareness is the answer. Not by choosing sides, but by reminding us that empathy and boundaries are not opposites. They are the two hemispheres of the same mind. And that's what this chapter is really about. Not the individual stories, but the shared evolution behind them. We are not witnessing a breakdown of family, we are witnessing a redefinition of it. One that will only become sustainable when awareness grows deep enough to include both accountability and grace. Next, we'll bring everything together, how guilt, grief, and awareness integrate to rebuild trust within yourself, and how that inner coherence becomes the foundation for peace, no matter what your relationship with your family looks like now. When I look at everything we have explored in this episode, one truth stands out. Going no contact isn't a statement about love. It is a study in meaning. It shows how the mind, when overwhelmed, tries to create coherence between peace and pain, loyalty and protection. And that search for coherence is what healing really is. No contact, distance, or even emotional detachment all exist on the spectrum of self-protection. But protection isn't the same as growth. Growth begins when we start asking deeper questions. Not just why did this happen, but what can this teach me about how I love, how I react, and how I rebuild? Those are the questions that turn survival into awareness. The most liberating realization I've seen people come to, and that I have lived in my own life, is that you can love someone and still need distance. And you can have distance and still need accountability. Love doesn't cancel the need for responsibility. The mind matures when it learns to see others as both human and limited, capable of care and capable of harm. That's where forgiveness, compassion, and self-respect finally meet. But awareness and self-regulation asks something from you too. It asks that you look inward with as much honesty as you've looked outward. Because when we experience pain, it's easy to build a story that keeps us safe from responsibility. The conscious mind-brain loop functions on narratives, victim and villain, good and bad, right and wrong. But real healing requires nuance. It requires seeing where we've contributed to the dynamic, even if our role was just silence, appeasement, or avoidance. That's not about blame, it's about authorship. The moment you recognize your own participation, you reclaim agency. Your brain stops looping on the question, why did they do this to me? And starts building new pathways towards how do I choose differently now? That shift from analysis to authorship changes the chemistry of your mind. It moves you from rumination to regulation. In neuroscience, this process is called emotional integration. It's when the prefrontal cortex, the reasoning center, and the limbic system, the emotional center, begin working in coherence. Integration doesn't erase pain. It organizes it. And that organization creates a kind of peace that feels different from avoidance. It's quieter, less reactive, more grounded. It's the peace that comes from not needing anyone else's behavior to define your meaning anymore. That's what I mean when I say peace isn't silence. It's internal steadiness. It's your mind and brain working together instead of against each other. If you've cut off contact, ask yourself, what am I doing with the peace I fought so hard to create? Is it helping me grow, or have I turned it into a shield? Real healing doesn't end with distance. It begins with what you do in the distance. How you use awareness to expand empathy, not shrink it. Because peace without compassion turns into pride, and compassion without boundaries turns into chaos. Awareness and self-regulation keep both in balance. For those who stayed and tried to rebuild, the challenge is different, but just as important. Ask yourself, am I rebuilding from guilt or from genuine desire for connection? Awareness and self-regulation don't demand you stay. They ask you to understand your motivation. When you act from guilt, the brain stays in survival loop. When you act from genuine intent, the prefrontal cortex functions really well and peace becomes sustainable. Across all these experiences, distance, repair, uncertainty, the lesson is the same. Awareness and self-regulation don't take sides. They simply bring everything into view. It lets you see that your mind and brain are always trying to protect you, even when their methods look contradictory. The brain wants safety, the mind wants meaning. When those two come into agreement, healing stops feeling like a fight. That's what coherence really is. When your thoughts, emotions, and actions stop competing and start cooperating. When the story you tell yourself matches the chemistry your brain is creating. It's not perfection, it's congruence. And this is the deeper invitation of everything we've explored in this episode. But to decide what kind of person you want to become in the aftermath. Because the real measure of healing isn't the distance you keep, it is the peace you maintain. It is how you treat others, even when they can't meet you where you are. The most powerful thing about the mind is that it is always free to assign new meaning. You can reinterpret the same memory 1,000 times until it stops controlling you. You can choose compassion without contact, forgiveness without reunion, and accountability without anger. That's the ultimate form of mental freedom, when your story no longer dictates your state. You are not your family story. You are the meaning you've chosen to give it. Every time you choose awareness and self-regulation over reaction, you are not just protecting yourself, you are shaping the future of connection for everyone who comes after you. Because when one person learns to manage their mind, the chemistry of generations begins to change. Peace is never the absence of relationship. It is the presence of coherence. And that kind of peace doesn't depend on who you've cut off or who you've reconnected with. It depends on whether your meaning aligns with your values. So whatever your relationship with your parents looks like now, distance, reconciled, or somewhere in between, remember, awareness and self-regulation give you the power to keep love honest and peace grounded. And if you want to take this deeper, to learn how to manage your mind through the complexity of emotions like guilt and grief and forgiveness in real time, join me inside the Help in a Hurry course. It's a 19-lesson journey designed to help you turn awareness and self-regulation into practice so you can find coherence no matter how chaotic life feels. Because peace doesn't come from distance or reunion, it comes from meaning, the kind your mind has the power to create every single day. Go to helpinahurrycourse.com. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to next time.